this was another one where we got a lot of people. Same with the Waterford one. People had requested. I can see James there. He'd requested that one specifically, and there's a few people who've been asking us to do American whiskey and bourbon. So I hope all of you you've asked are live now, or at least watching the recording and excited to try these whiskies. So for those of you who is the first time joining, we do want you to ask as many questions as possible and get your tasting notes into the chat. And yeah, after that, other than that, that's kind of fairly it. So I'll pass over to yourself, Stephen, to introduce yourself, and I believe you've got a lovely slide to share with us.
I do, Luke. Thanks very much. And first of all, thank you to everyone for joining tonight. I know it always amazes me, really, just the sheer interest that people have in whiskey, and that people would take the time out of their evening to log in and listen to someone talk about it in depth. It really is a massive honor for me as well. First of all, to work with all of you, and to be hosted by the Whisky Shop. So thank you all for joining. I'll introduce myself a little bit first. You can probably tell by the accents, just like Luke, I'm also Irish originally. I've been away for quite a long time. I've been away out of Ireland for about 10 years now. I started off in the bar trade, used to be a bartender. I noticed quite quickly that I was better at the talking part of the job than I was at the shaking drinks part of the job. So naturally enough, I ended up in sales. And I ended up working for Michter's in quite a roundabout way. So I used to be the sales rep that sold it in Amsterdam, of all places, worked at all the top cocktail bars over there. Eventually got offered a job by the wonderful people over at Michter's, the family behind the Maliolco family. That was back in 2020. And since then, I've been based in London, but what I actually do is look after most of Europe for the brand. I'm somewhat of a split between the sales manager, the brand ambassador, and depending on the time of the day, whatever the family behind Michter's needs me to be. Bit of a jack of all trades, but that means I get through the fun part of the job, which is talking about whiskey with the people who drink it at the end of the day. So that's where we're going to go. We're going to talk you through where Michter's came from as a brand. We're going to talk through the history of it, but mostly we're going to focus on what makes the actual whiskey itself special, because, you know, everyone's got a fantastic story. Everyone can tell you why their brand is the best, but really what we focus on is what makes the whiskey special. What do we do to make it special, and why is it worth a premium price point? That's what we're very much focused on. So as well, I don't want this to be a monologue. So if at any point you want to drop a question in the chat, please do. I'd much rather it be a conversation than I just sit up here for an hour and talk into the void. So please, questions, love questions. Hopefully I can answer all of them. If I can't answer all of them, well, then I've got the phone number of the master distiller, the master maturation, and I can always shoot them a text and come back to you with an answer if I don't know something. So we're going to start off. I'm just going to share a little presentation I have. Don't worry, it's not going to be death by PowerPoint. It's just so you have kind of a visual that you can see as well. I'm going to keep it as focused on the chat as much as we can. Let me just share this. No matter how many times I try to share a presentation, I still manage to find the wrong screen. Give me a second.
While you're putting that out, Stephen, I suppose the one thing that I should have actually said to you beforehand that we normally a lot of our regulars like to know is the order we're going to go in, just so they can get them kind of prepared and set up in front of them. So if you could give us that as well, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a very good question. So usually I start off with the bourbon, then I go for the US1 rye, then I do the US1 sour mash, then the American whiskey, and then it will be the toasted sour mash to finish. So that's generally the order that I like to do it in. You'll see them as we go along. They'll be in the presentation too, but if you want to pre-pour the bourbon to start with, that's what I would recommend. So we're all ready to go. Does that make sense for everyone?
Yeah, so it's bourbon, rye, unblended, regular sour mash, toasted sour mash. Was that the order?
Bourbon, rye, sour mash, unblended, okay, and then toasted sour mash.
Marvelous. Apologies, got that wrong, but there we go. Excellent. So if you have your glasses ready, folks, we'll get that poured. And in the meantime, as you can all see now, you've got the PowerPoint as well ahead of you.
All right. Well, first things first, I'm almost contractually obliged to do a little bit of bragging at the start of the presentation. So sorry in advance, but this is something we're super proud of. There is a very famous drinks magazine called Drinks International, and every year they do awards for different spirits brands. It's very, very important in the industry. And I wanted to show you this just a little bit first. So in 2022, Michter's was named overall number 2 most admired whiskey by Drinks International. That's across all categories. That's including Scotch, including Irish, including Japanese, including all of the world's whiskeys. Michter's come in number 2, and that's something we're incredibly proud of. Part of the same publication, and something that we're also very proud of. It was #1 top trending brand. This is generally focusing on what's popular in the world's best cocktail bars and restaurants, and we're a brand that works very closely with bars and restaurants. Most of our team have a hospitality background, just like I do. Again, something we just like to show off a little bit. But we're going to launch into the whiskey first. So I know there's all sorts of tastings. I've been to a lot of whiskey tastings in my time as well, where you're sitting there and you're sitting there. The guy's talking and he's talking and he's talking. And you're like, this is wonderful, but when are we actually going to taste some whiskey? So we like to do it a little bit differently. We like to start with the whiskey, get a little bit of lubrication and go from there. So if you wouldn't mind pouring out some of your US1 bourbon, that would be fantastic. And I'm going to talk you through a little bit about what bourbon whiskey is, some of the rules, regulations, and then what you can expect from Michter's bourbon. So bourbon whiskey is probably the most famous category of American whiskey. A lot of people think, if it's American, it must be bourbon. If it's bourbon, it must be American. Some truth to that. Bourbon is one of the most highly regulated whiskey categories in the entire world, right? It's very, very strict in what you can and can't do, along with its sister category of rye whiskey. We'll talk about that a little bit later. They're very similar categories, but bourbon is the one that most people think of. Now, some of the things that make bourbon has to be made in the United States, distilled and matured in the United States. It can be distilled and produced or distilled and matured anywhere in the United States. Most famous state for it is Kentucky, of course, where 95% of US bourbon is produced, but theoretically, you could make it in Alaska. You could make it in Hawaii because they're part of the United States, but then it wouldn't be Kentucky bourbon. It'd just be regular old bourbon, right? Some of the other key characteristics is the mash bill. So that's the mix of grains that go into it. All of the Michter's whiskeys are made of 3 grains. That's corn, which is yellow and sweet, which you're probably familiar with. Rye, which is a little bit greenish grain, is quite spicy. And you got malted barley, which you're very familiar with from Scotch whiskey. Our whiskeys are all a blend of those 3, but bourbon has to contain minimum 51% corn in the mash bill to be considered bourbon, right? So it generally has more of a sweeter profile due to that high corn content. You can go all the way up to 100% corn if you wanted to. Would be quite one-dimensional, but you could theoretically do that. We are aiming for balance, so that's what we always, the mix of those 3 grains, sweet, balanced with spicy, balanced with that depth of flavor from the malted barley. Other things. You see all that beautiful rich color in there? Well, unlike other categories of whiskey in the world, we're not allowed to add any color, flavor, sugar, additives after the fact. So you know that all of that color is coming directly from the wood. We're not allowed to change the color in any way, shape, or form. So you know that that's entirely coming out of those barrels. Speaking of barrels, another key characteristic of bourbon whiskey is the fact that it has to be matured in new oak containers. The most common type of wood that people use for bourbon is American white oak because, well, it's in America and it's fairly common and fairly easy to grow. But theoretically, you can use any type of oak you want. You can use French oak, you can use chinkapin oak, and we have experimented a little bit with different types of oak, which we'll talk about later. But generally, a charred new oak container is what you're aiming for. In terms of age statements, it gets a little bit squirrely over here, and this takes a little bit of explanation. So, regular old bourbon whiskey, there is no minimum age statement. Right? You could stick it into a barrel for 1 day, roll it down a hill, pour it back out, and call it bourbon, but you'd have to put 1 day old on the label. Okay. If it's anywhere below 2 years old, you would have to put the number on the label. For Kentucky straight bourbon, which is a slightly higher quality content, it has to be minimum 2 years old, but then the rule changes to if any of it is below 4 years old, you'd have to have a number on the label. So that's quite confusing to think about, but basically the rule is this. If you see the label and it says straight bourbon and you don't see any number on it at all, as in no age statement, you know it's minimum 4 years old. If you do see a number on the label, then you know that's the age of the whiskey. It's fairly simple. So you see straight, you see no number, you know it's minimum 4 years old. Michter's bourbon is actually generally between 5 and 7 years old. We always tend to overage, but that's just the way we do things. But you know, absolute bare minimum is 4 years old. We all following so far?
Yeah, no, it's good, good grand information. What I've always wondered, Stephen, is why did they name it after a chocolate biscuit?
So that's a question that has many, many answers, and I'm not entirely sure which one of them is true. There's all sorts of legends about it. So you got Bourbon Street in New Orleans, where the ships used to come in down the river boats will come in down from Kentucky carrying whiskey, and some people think that it was named after Bourbon Street. there's another point of view that says, like you said, with the biscuits. So bourbon was coming from the French royal family, the House of Bourbon, and bourbon became kind of the name became a mark of quality, which is why you see it attached to biscuits, you see it attached to sugar, and they think that it might have been a way to attach the status of royalty and quality to the whiskey, and they named it after that. There's all sorts of competing theories. I don't think anyone's ever been proved 100% correct, but it's nice to think about as well. That's one way to look at it. So have a little smell, have a little taste. I try not to give people tasting notes in advance because to me it feels a little bit like cheating. It's the power of suggestion, and I'm always putting things to people's heads. But I'd love to hear some comments about what people think about it.
It's so much kind of like caramelized sugars and stuff in there. It's really interesting. Nice bit of spice on the end. We love to hear everyone's tasting notes. In the meanwhile, while people taste, as Craig says, quite rich and oily in the mouth, chewy. Totally agree. James has asked, is there any particular reason behind these strict legalities? Am I right in thinking it's quite a relatively modern thing, the kind of rules and stipulations around bourbon, is it not?
I would say it's related to prohibition, quite a lot of it, because alcohol production and sale in the United States is so incredibly controlled after prohibition. There were rules and regulations before that, but it's really with the introduction of prohibition, and then even when prohibition was lifted, that's where those rules came in, because it was so because for so long it was illegal, and people were producing, because it was illegal, people were producing basically moonshine to get around the laws, and a lot of people were dying because, you know, it was very badly distilled or badly stored, a lot of methanol in it, people were going blind. And it was kind of a fight back against that. They decided, well, if we're going to do it, we're going to make sure that it's done 100% correctly. And the other reason is tax revenues, because a lot of these things with bonded warehouses and all these different things are, you know, more or less designed to ensure that the government is getting their proper tax take. And doing it that way made people have to stick to all the rules and regulations to qualify to even be in those bonded warehouses. That's why you see things like bottled in bond as a mark of quality. It was because they knew that nothing would be tampered with, because it was literally watched over by government agents, that nothing could go in or out without their say so. So it was to prevent counterfeit whiskey and things being passed off as whiskey that weren't of a quality that would be able to drink.
They're always very popular, the excise duty man.
Exactly.
So James said this is so much sweeter than I expected. Caramelized banana, honeyed vanilla. Don Smith, who's not Don Smith, who's Andy, I believe, has said yes, very sweet honey, very short finish. So yeah, it's quite interesting. I love the kind of tannins you get from that virgin oak, the way it kind of starts to grip in most bourbons. Although it's really nicely balanced here. It's not too kind of tannic forward, and that spice really comes through. You talk about the different mash bills and corn and stuff. What is the ratio that goes into this one?
That's one thing I can't tell you, as much as I would love to, because we talk about almost everything that we do, and the one thing that the master distiller will not release is the exact mash bill. Now, I don't even know the answer to that question, and he sure as hell won't tell me. That's the one thing we keep secret. But what I can say to you is this: with Michter's, we're aiming for balance, so it's not extreme in any one direction. It's obviously leaning slightly in the direction of corn because it has to qualify as a bourbon, but there's quite a lot of rye in there, with malted barley being the smallest component. But I can't tell you the exact amount. But with the mouthfeel and viscosity, that's something we're going to come back to later, because that's not necessarily inherent in bourbon, but it is related to the barrel entry proof and some of the proprietary methods that we use in production. But those I could talk through in full detail, and it'll make more sense when we get to that point. Fair enough?
No, that's fair enough. I get a bit of kind of like a toasted marshmallow almost over it, but I'm not sure if that's a really cheesy tasting note. And Chris says they got caramelized toffee / banana. Melts them getting the old licorice wood sticks I used to chew as a child. Brown sugar oak. So yeah, no, some fantastic tasting notes, folk. Keep them coming in. I can tell you now that this is £58 on the website, and we'll be giving you a 15% discount at the end. So yeah, good value for any whiskey, particularly for a bourbon of this quality. I'd say. I presume you'd have to agree with that, Stephen.
I would 100% agree with that. What I love about the Michter's US 1 range, which is the first four we're tasting tonight, is that they are complex, but they're not a murder mystery. You don't need to sit down and analyze it with a microscope. They're relatively easy drinkers, but they have enough complexity that if you want to sit there and enjoy it, you absolutely can. That's what I like about them.
Craig says it would be a shame to mix it as most bourbons are. Would you? I mean, I know obviously there's a cocktail recommendation that goes in. That was in your box as we discussed at the start. And although it's not a bourbon, I suppose one of the most famous kind of iconic whiskey combos is a Jack and Coke. Although yeah, I'm not going to get caught out in calling it a bourbon. But would you how do you would you agree with Craig's statement that most of the mix? I suppose like the backbone of a good whiskey sour or an old fashioned is a bourbon. So I'd say a lot of it goes into cocktails, all right.
I would have to disagree, Craig, I'm afraid, because first of all, I used to be a bartender, so I would have zero integrity left if I suddenly said the cocktails are terrible. I have to say, if you do it right, a cocktail can take a good whiskey to a different level. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's better, but it does mean that it's different. Now, if we're talking about a whiskey Coke, fair enough. There, I will agree with you. I think, look, I don't judge anyone. If that's the way you like to enjoy your whiskey, 100% okay with it. You're buying it. You can do as you wish with it. It tastes great. It's totally fine. I think where you really see the whiskey shown off is in classic cocktails and some of the more avant-garde things that we see in bars today. But you can't go wrong with an old-fashioned. But a Manhattan, a bourbon Manhattan, you can do a rye Manhattan as well. I really love bourbon Manhattans for whatever reason. It's my flavor profile. It's one of the best things you can have. It really makes that whiskey shine,
I would have to chime in. I mean, or agree with that. I mean, by chime in by agreeing, sorry, I've forgotten how to speak there. But like when you see it so much, especially now with the kind of boom in cocktails in the last 10 years in bars, you see people substituting a local whiskey. In Ireland, you see a lot of Jameson cocktails, or in Scotland, you see a lot of kind of Scotch whiskey in kind of classic American cocktails, and it's not to criticize those particular brands of fantastic whiskies, but having that virgin oak and that kind of rye spice, it really does punch through in a well balanced cocktail. So you are missing out when you try and use a different form of whiskey, I think.
Absolutely. And look, when it comes to cocktails, I mean, I've had these, not to go too far into the sales end of it, but I've had these arguments with people who are running bars, bar managers, F&B directors of places, and they ask me, well, why should we use Michter's in a cocktail as opposed to whatever brand that's half the price? And it's a fair question because they need to make their margins and they want to know, is our guest going to notice the difference? And what I always say is this: look, everything you do in a bar matters. The ingredients matter. The base spirit, which is 90% of the drink, are you telling me that the quality of the base spirit makes no difference to the quality of the cocktail in the end? I mean, look, people go in and they order gin tonics are massive, right? People will pay extra for a fever tree tonic or a special tonic as opposed to your standard Schweppes tonic. You telling me the mixer is more important than the base spirit? I don't think so. Everything matters. At the end of the day, it comes down to quality.
Yeah, no, I would have to agree. We got some more comments coming in on that on those cocktails as well. Alex says, I have to agree with the old fashioned all the way. One of the nicest cocktails I like. Tony C says, love an old fashioned Johnny Ginger whiskey sour. I think this would make a great old fashioned. Agree. Ingredients totally matter. And James says, after a while, I'm getting a bitter burnt sugar finish at the back of the tongue. I know there was a comment earlier from Andy about the short finish, but I think the more, maybe it's spending longer time with the whiskey, it's kind of, whether it was there from the start, I can't remember, but I'm definitely getting a nice long finish off it now as we sip away. It's a nice old dram, and you can't beat that mouthfeel. Before we come on to the rye, is there anything you wanted to add in, or anyone wants to ask on this particular bourbon? Stephen, is there any parting comments that we should know before we move on?
I think that was it for the bourbon. I just wanted to run you through the history of the brand next real quick, and then we're going to pop onto the rye. So
we got a comment there from Lewis. Says the presentation says it's a premium high-end drink at 58 pounds. It's not that expensive in the scheme of things, about $65 on quick Google. What is the market like in US? Most people drinking Jack Daniel's a similar high price point. I suppose the premium point there from Lewis is an interesting one. I mean, for most people, premium is anything over like 25, 30 pounds. If you think of where the volume of whiskey sales actually are in the grand scheme of things. So, anything over that is I suppose technically classed as premium. Do you have anything to add on Lewis's comment there, Stephen?
I think it's a fair point. I mean, premium is relative. I mean, Michter's actually sits in the super premium category, which when you think about it, because a lot of people, I'd imagine the people that are in this tasting aren't going out and drinking bottom shelf whiskey very, very often, or else they probably wouldn't be interested in a tasting like this. So I think, look, this happens to me as well. For my sins, I'm surrounded by really good quality spirits, and that's what I think of as normal. But we have to understand that for the vast majority of people, they're not going to pay £60 for a bottle of whiskey. That wouldn't occur to them. The vast majority of whiskey sales are in that very, very low end. I'm not naming any brands, but I think we all know if you walk into Tesco and look at the spirit selection, look at the shelf, you have to compare it versus that, and there is, especially if you go to the States, there are things in the States that you can buy that you can't even sell in Europe as whiskey.
I hope you're not criticizing mellow corn here, because I won't have it on this conversation.
I said no brand names. What I'm saying is when you take the entire category as a whole, then we're sitting up in the super premium category. And the other thing you have to remember is this is our core range. This is our, for want of a better word, entry level. I don't really like that term, entry level, because it starts off premium. But Michter's goes all the way up to, the 10-year bourbon, 10-year rye comes up next there, a couple of £100 a bottle, all the way up to the Michter's Celebration Sour Mash, which is coming out this year, which the recommended retail price of that is $6,000 a bottle. So it depends on how premium you want to get, There's a whiskey for every budget.
I've tried the 25-year-old bourbon. I hear the rye is amazing though.
The 25-year-old rye, I swear to God, I've only tried it once at the distillery, and look, of course I'm going to sit here and rave about my own brand, but of course it's a delicious whiskey, right? That goes without saying, but it is one of the most special spirits in general, that I've ever tasted in my entire life. It's pretty spectacular.
Brilliant. We'll maybe come back onto that one if people are interested. So anyway, we were moving on to the next section there, Stephen.
So I'm going to show you a little bit about the history. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you to death with death by history lesson, but I just wanted to show you a little bit about it quickly. So if you look at the bottle, well, you don't have the full bottle in front of you. If you could look at the label, you would see it says 1753 on the label. That doesn't mean that, it's the same people that own the back at 1753, unless they're living a very, very long time. But that's where we trace our heritage back to. So right now we're in Kentucky. We trace our heritage back to Michter's in Pennsylvania, and they trace their heritage back to a distillery called Schenk's. So there's a guy called John Schenk, set up Schenk's distillery in 1753. He was a Swiss farmer. That was then taken over by the Bomberger family in the mid-1800s. Changed hands, went through Prohibition, closed the stores during Prohibition, was producing, industrial alcohol for the war effort and different things during Prohibition. After Prohibition reopened, then we're in the 1950s, and then it was owned by a family called the Foreman family. So the owner was a guy called Lou Foreman, and this is where the name Michter's actually comes in, because it's not a family name. It sounds like it could be German, could be Dutch. It's much simpler than that, and it's much sillier than that. So Lou Foreman had two sons, Michael Foreman and Peter Foreman. And he thought, how can I honor both of them at once? So he took the first half of Michael and the second half of Peter and put those two together, and that's where you got Michter's. So it was a 1950s advertising agency responsible for that one, I think.
The original Brangelina, huh?
Literally exactly that. People have been mispronouncing it ever since. I've heard Michter's, I've heard Machters, I've heard every possible variation you can think of. That's where it came from. But the 1950s was also the peak of American whiskey, maybe except for the present day. And it's kind of the period, I always think of that series. Has anyone seen the series Mad Men? On Netflix? It was a long time ago now, I think, but it's like an advertising agency. Everyone's always wearing beautiful suits, drinking old fashions and smoking cigars. That's kind of what I think of as the 1950s. Everyone drank whiskey. From 20 years old up to 90 years old, people drank whiskey. So what people did was, or what companies did, was there was such a massive demand. They were producing as much whiskey as they humanly could, filling up as many barrels as they possibly could, filling up warehouses left, right, and center. Fantastic. Would have been fantastic, except for whiskey is a very long-term business, and you can't just turn off the tap overnight because you're left with all that stock sitting there. And what happened was in the late 60s, early 70s, but especially the 1980s, we saw the rise of white spirits, and specifically vodka. Some cheap white rum as well, and gin a little bit, but vodka was the big thing. And suddenly whiskey wasn't really cool anymore. It was what your dad drank. It was what your granddad drank. And the younger generation wanted blue cocktails and pink cocktails and everything else. And it wasn't really the go-to spirit for that. So it wasn't that whiskey stopped being consumed. There was still a massive amount of people that consumed whiskey, but it fell off a cliff massively. And the problem was, because they had so much whiskey already produced, a lot of distilleries just didn't have to produce anymore, and they went bankrupt. So the original Michters in Pennsylvania went bankrupt in 1989. And like a lot of what we're going to talk about with American whiskey in general is kind of a phoenix from the ashes story. It's a story of rebirth, but so is the brand of Michters. So it would have been gone, it would have been lost to history, except for our current owners. So our president now, our owner is called Joseph Malioco. He's based over in New York. At the time, he was a sales rep for a company in New York, and they used to sell Michters. So he used to do what I used to do back in Amsterdam. And he heard the brand went bankrupt, and he thought, well, that's a shame because I really like that brand. Maybe there's something I could do with it. So he acquired the abandoned trademark for $240. Now that he didn't even buy it, that was the legal fee it took for him to acquire an abandoned trademark. He paid $240. Didn't get a distillery, didn't get any whiskey, didn't get any barrels, didn't get any bottles. He literally got this hot still image, this text. That's basically what he got. And he decided he wanted to restart the brand. Now, how do you restart a whiskey brand with no whiskey, no distillery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Well, he went to Kentucky and decided to pick out single barrels of bourbon and single barrels of rye that were of a style and a flavor that he would like to emulate someday when he had his own distillery. So the initial Michters back in 1990s, that was our phase one. That was barrel picks from other distilleries in Kentucky that we were bottling and selling as Michters. Always been very open about it. It's not like a secret or something, fully transparent. Phase two, the brand started to gain some steam behind it, started to get a little bit more successful. And then they started contract distilling. So contract distilling is where you go to another distillery, this is also in Kentucky, and you basically use their excess capacity and have them produce your whiskey for you. So we were producing whiskey in somebody else's distillery to our mash bill, our specs, with our barrels, our maturation processes, basically cooking in somebody else's kitchen. That's more or less what we were doing. And then as of 2015, we're in phase three, where we have not one but two of our like fully owned distilleries that are completely ours. Two Michters distilleries, both in Kentucky, and they are producing all of our whiskey now. So that's kind of how we got to where we are now. Any questions on that so far? Does it all make sense, the story?
Yeah, no, yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, in the 90s, I think it was particularly bad for bourbon, wasn't it? In low point in sales as well. So it's an interesting time to kind of do all that after the brand had gone bankrupt.
Absolutely, yeah. And we're going to talk about the rye whiskey in a second. And then rye whiskey was even more of a dead kind of a dead dodo than bourbon was, because rye was the original category of American whiskey. Right? If you walk back into the 1800s, the 1700s even, if you walked into a bar in New York in 1820, should we say, just for the sake of argument, and you said, bartender, give me a whiskey, almost 99% certain you're going to get a rye whiskey. There's a couple of reasons for that. But the main reason is that the original settlers, when they come over to the east coast of the United States, they brought rye with them. Rye is an old world crop. People have been using it in Europe for thousands and thousands of years to make bread from, to distill from, everything else. So it was a crop that they were familiar with. Corn was a new world crop that they were, at least that type of corn was a new world crop that they were less used to. So initially they defaulted towards rye. Now the thing about whiskey is now we consider it a consumer product. We consider it something that you make for its own sake. But whiskey used to be kind of a, what would you call it, an agricultural side product, shall we say? Because if you produce a lot of grain, which is the raw material for whiskey, it's quite hard to store grain. Actually, you know, you can make it into bread and kind of store that, but before refrigeration, before everything, all you could do is hope to keep your grain dry, and you could try to store it year after year. But one easy way to store excess grain was to turn it into something else, and that something else was either beer. Well, if you distill beer, you get whiskey. That's how whiskey kind of started off. It was kind of what you would do with your excess grain, because then you could sell it, you could trade it for something else, you could drink it, get through the long hard winters with it. So when those first settlers come over to the United States, they started making rye whiskey more so. Now, rye is a very, very similar category to bourbon in terms of the rules and regulations. It's got almost all the same rules. Everything we talked about for bourbon applies, as in has to be made in the United States. If it's Kentucky rye, it has to be made obviously in Kentucky. If it's straight rye, it's a minimum of 2 years old unless there's minimum of 4 years old unless there's another number on the label. No color, no additive, no sugar, no flavorings, nothing like that. The key difference is in the mash bill. So where bourbon tends to be, or has to be actually 51% corn minimum, rye whiskey has to be 51% rye minimum. Michter's whiskies are always 3 grains, so it's still got corn in there, it's still got malted barley, but it's leaning more towards the rye end of it. There's actually an interesting story about rye as well on the east coast of the United States. Anyone heard about the Salem witch trials back in the day, where they were hunting for witches and thought people were possessed by the devil and all this? Have you guys heard about that? Yeah, there's a really interesting theory behind that, which I heard about recently. And they think that it might have been mass psychosis caused by rye. And that's because there's a certain type of fungus whose name escapes me right now that grows, it's called ergot, that's what it's called, ergot, that grows on rye crops. And if you get exposed to ergot, you get ergot poisoning, and the chemical component of it is basically the same thing as LSD. So they think that the Salem witch trials might have been caused by mass tripping, caused by ergot poisoning, which would explain quite a lot of things. Don't worry, it can pass through distillation, so fairly sure you're not going to be tripping after drinking the rye whiskey, but that's a really interesting theory of where it came from. Anyway, what were we talking about? I got sidetracked there. I tend to get sidetracked when we talk about history.
No, that's a good one. I was actually only thinking and reading about witch trials in 1600s Europe the other day, but we won't. It's too big a rabbit hole to go down, you know.
That's a different type of toasting and charting we're talking about, you know. We'll come back to that later. So anyway, rye whiskey was the original category, and it was only after Prohibition really that it went into decline. And I could never entirely figure out why it was, but I think maybe bourbon had better marketing, better branding. We talk about the whole bourbon as a mark of quality, blah, blah, blah. And rye, for some reason, became seen as what, woof, woof, who was that?
Sorry.
Rye became seen as what hillbillies drank, what your drunk uncle drank. It became seen as cheap moonshine. And sure, there was some of that out there, but by no means was it all of the rye whiskey. But that's the image it had. So much so that Joe Malioka, when he was selling rye whiskey in New York in the late 80s, early 90s, if they would see a hearse go past, a car with a coffin in it, they would say, look, there goes another rye drinker. Because it was only really, really old people that drank rye. And it was a dying category. And the funny thing was, the reason it came back was bartenders brought it back. Because they looked at all of those original cocktail recipes from people like Jerry Thomas and all these guys that were in the 1800s. And you look at the original recipes for your old fashioned, for your Manhattan, even for your whiskey sour, they all call for rye whiskey. And bartenders started saying, well, how come I can find like one rye whiskey maybe that's not very good? And it was that demand that really brought rye whiskey back. And that actually inspired John Malioka to bring back Michter's, because originally he just wanted to do rye whiskeys. That's all he wanted to do. Do I see Jerry Thomas's book over there? I think someone's showing it to me.
It's me, Jerry Thomas's Guide to Bartending. Iconic.
Fantastic.
Worth picking up if folks, if you're interested in your drinks history.
So, but yeah, that was what brought it back, because people said, well, okay, rye whiskey, there was demand for rye whiskey. So originally Joe was just going to do rye whiskeys. I think his accountants stepped in and said, well, if you want to be a successful brand, you might have to do bourbon as well, because it is the biggest category of American whiskey. So he relented, and I'm glad he did, because I love bourbon as well. But that's kind of how rye came back. Why don't we have a taste of it, though? I've been nattering on for quite a while now. So if you wouldn't mind pouring yourself some rye, please have a smell, have a taste. Let me know what you think. Really interested to hear.
As people sip away in that, it's fascinating. I was reading this thing literally last week. I'm not sure how apocryphal it is, but claiming that you were saying about people drinking spirits, and particularly brown spirits, historically in America, that the advent of kind of the beer culture and beer industry in America doesn't really take off until after the 1880s, which is when you have a huge influx of German migration into the country, from Germany, obviously, newly formed Germany at the time. But 1.5 million Germans go into America in those decades, and that's when the beer culture in America really takes off, coming from their background in producing German beers. So it's a relatively, the history of aged spirits goes back much further. Got some interesting comments coming in there. Alex is not a fan. It's good to be honest, Alex. James says, a question on alcohol percentage, volume of all of these in the night. Is there a reason for certain strength, like the duty getting into the UK? Are there any cask strength variations of these, or is the new make liquid not a high percentage to begin with? That's an interesting one. Craig says light spice, white pepper, really dry after a few seconds. James's question on the ABV, I believe the one on this is 42.4. So it is interesting, and it's obviously not Well, I don't say obviously because maybe I'm wrong, but it look doesn't. You wouldn't guess that that's cask strength. So what's the kind of reasoning behind that? And I know a lot of bourbons, the American version does have a higher ABV. I won't name brands, but yeah,
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. And I think you've touched on a couple of the major points. So first, the first part of that, no, it's not to do with taxes or anything to do with that, because our ABVs are consistent across whether they're sold in the United States or sold elsewhere. Cask strength for us is usually between 55 and 57. We're going in at a very low barrel entry proof. I'm going to talk about that in a lot more detail a little bit later on, because I want to show you visually as well so you see it. But we have quite a low cask strength relative to some other brands. So between 55 57 is usually cask strength for us. There is a barrel strength rye. There's a toasted barrel strength rye. The reason it is between 55 57 is because they're all single barrels. So each cask will have its own unique cask strength. With the variety of ABVs between the US 1 range, so you're dead right. The US 1 bourbon is 45.7, which is the strongest. The straight rye is 42.4. The sour mash is 43. And the unblended American is 41.7. So the reason that they're all such awkward numbers, I think, is testament to what a strange company we actually are, because it is a 100% family-owned company, which sounds amazing, right? And it is amazing because we have no shareholders. We don't have to report to anyone. They can pump all of the money into making the best possible American whiskey, which is what they do. They don't have to report to any accountants or anybody else. But it also means that it is, in fact, a family, and they have arguments over what's the best way to do things. So we have a tasting panel, right? And the tasting panel is several members of the family. So it's Joe, a couple of his brothers, some of his children. Then it's people like our master distiller, master of maturation, some of our sales team. It's like a panel of experts on whiskey. And they, anytime we have a new release, they all get together and they taste all different varieties of the whiskey, different finishes, different ABVs. And that's how they kind of decide what should be released and what should not be released. Because we do a lot of different experiments, just that most of the things that we play around with don't quite make the cut. It's a very small minority of projects that we actually turn into real products. So when they were doing the comparison of ABVs for the US 1 range, the debate raged for many, many days, in fact, weeks, I believe, where they were all saying, no, I think it's better at 45. I think it's better at 46. I think it's better at 44. It's on and on and on and on. And the master distiller at the time cut the Gordian knot by saying, right, everyone write down what your favorite ABV is for this particular release. He got them all, wrote them all down, added them up, and averaged them. And that's what they ended up being for these particular whiskeys. That's how we ended up with such odd decimal numbers.
No, that's fascinating. We got some more kind of tasting notes coming in there. So Darren says, well, I think I said that, but I'll read it out anyway. On the nose, I get fresh apples, pears, taste vanilla fudge, slight smoke, very finish, very light spice and smooth. Vicky says, one of my favorite ryes, dried orange, licorice and cinnamon, yum. Andy says, the nose is fresh cut wood, quite oily, more delicate than I thought. Matt says peppery, butterscotch, dry spiciness, and Stefano says I almost find this savory. And you know, I agree with Stefano there. But when I was nosing it before we tasted it, I was expecting quite the opposite. But once you drink it, it definitely is. I mean, I personally I love a rye whiskey, but I can understand Alex. Alex, who said he wasn't a fan because it can, that kind of spiciness. It can just not beat everyone's taste. It is a bit more Marmite than other whiskies. I suppose in a similar way that a peated Scotch is or whatever.
Sure. And look, that's why we make all different flavors of whiskey. There's one for everybody, we think. You don't have to like everything, and we wouldn't expect you to. The thing with rye whiskey as well is there's all different styles of rye whiskey. I mean, you got very famous brands like, say, that are Indiana style rye that are produced over at MGP, which is literally just across the river from Louisville, where we are. And they're very dry, very spicy. I mean, a famous brand is very well known as Bullet. That's 95% rye. Nothing wrong with that. That's their style of rye whiskey. And you got Canadian style rye, which can be all the way up to 100% rye. We're producing Kentucky style rye, and that tends to be much more corn heavy than other rye. So you've got that. It tends to start sweet and end spicy, in my opinion. It starts off with a little bit sweet note, and it does end with that nice white peppery note at the back. So it's kind of like, you know, with spicy food, what goes well with spicy food, add a little bit of sugar to it, and it tends to balance it out. That's kind of what we're doing with the balance between the rye and the corn. We're looking for that balance. But yeah, as you get used to it, it's definitely the second, third sip become a little bit less spicy, and you start to get more of those sweeter notes that come through on the end. And for cocktails, I think it really shines through even more, because that spice helps to punch through the other ingredients that might be in a cocktail, especially if you got a vermouth in there, it's got some decent amount of sugar in there. If you got the sugar itself in there, that rye helps to stand out in the drink as well, you know.
No, fantastic. It's a really interesting one. Sean says found it quite aggressive at first, but mellowed as I've been sipping. This is £56, and you get 15% off that tonight, and that code's valid for the next 2 weeks. So, if you're enjoying it, it's worth buying a bottle. Tony C says after the spice, I think the finish has almost has notes almost like agave, light vegetation or vegetal. I can totally see where Tony's coming from there. Let's say hypothetically, Stephen, someone was thinking of purchasing this. Is there a cocktail you'd recommend it for? I know this is the one that's on our cocktail card tonight, isn't it?
It is indeed, yeah. That's on the cocktail card now. I mean, look, any classic drink that was historically with rye, I think if you're making drinks at home and you want to be guaranteed a good drink, you can't go wrong with an old fashioned. That's generally my go-to. I mean, look, I was trained as a bartender. I know how to make more advanced drinks, but my go-to is an old fashioned. That's what I really, really enjoy.
Yeah, well, that's the it's the key to acing any art form. It's to be able to do the more complex things, but then enjoy and revel in the more simple things. Like, Picasso could have painted much more interesting shapes than he did, but he just.
I'm not going to compare myself to Picasso. I was never that.
No, that's brilliant. I suppose we could maybe start coming on to the next slide if there's more coming for us.
So I'm going to flick back for a second and just show you our Shively distillery. So I mentioned we have 2 distilleries. Shively is our main production center where 99% of the whiskey is produced. You can see there the picture on the outside. From the outside, to be honest, it doesn't look all that interesting, does it? It looks like a sales office or an industrial estate somewhere. But
it looks like the CIA office that the American Dad works at, Langley Falls or something like that.
Looks like Langley, yeah. Actually, it does. I never noticed that before. It does with the flag and everything. It does actually, yeah. But I was always told that it's what's on the inside that counts, and that's where the Malioco family have spent the money. So we're not saying this to brag, right? It always sounds a little bit like, oh, we're bragging. Look how much money we spent on the place. It's not because, hey, look, we're flash and we can throw all the cash at it. It's not that. It's because honestly, their mission statement, and I've seen the way these people work. Their only desire is to make the greatest possible American whiskey. It's up to people to decide if we succeed or not, but that is what gets them out of bed every single day. So anything they can do to make that whiskey better, whether it's better equipment, hiring and looking after really good staff, whether it's all those little details, that's what they go for. I think one thing that's really illustrative of that fact, that's the hard word, isn't it? Illustrative. One thing that really illustrates that fact is the still. I mean, that's the heart of any distillery. So most American whiskey is produced in a column still, and then sometimes a column to pot still. This beautiful beast here that you can see is a 100% copper column to pot still produced by another family company in Louisville called Vendome. I've been down to Vendome shop, and what they do, I mean, everything's handmade. It's really, really a craft what they do. They've been doing it for a couple of 100 years. Why does 100% copper matter? Well, most of these stills you would see, they tend to be stainless steel on the outside. On the inside, they have copper plates, right? Why do they do that? Well, the reason is copper is really, really, really expensive, especially if you need enough of it to make a machine like this. So people tend to cut corners in that. We don't cut corners at Michter's. We like to do it proper way. So the more copper contact your new make spirit has as it's being distilled, it removes those sulfuric compounds in the whiskey and gives you a lighter, cleaner, smoother spirit that also incidentally gives you much, much less of a hangover. So that's always good to know. This thing, it doesn't really show well in the picture, I have to say, but I've stood beside it and it's about 5 stories tall, just to give you an example of how big the column is, and then it goes into a pot still doubler. Now it's not 2 separate stills, they're both linked, it's one continuous system. So what happens is your distiller's beer goes into the bottom of the column still, that's distilled, comes off as your low wines, shall we say, is redirected into the pot still doubler. What comes off that is your high wines, that's around about 69%, and that's your new make spirit. But if the rate of it's going too fast, what is in the pot still doubler can be redirected into the bottom of the column still. So it is also a continuous loop. So you can't say, like, say Irish whiskey triple distilled. You can't technically say that with American whiskey because some of it might have gone through a lot more times than that. It's hard to say exactly where you would draw that line, which is why it's one continuous system. And that's just one example of the things that we spend the money on at Michter's, but I think that's really a really beautiful way to illustrate it. And then I wanted to show you real quick the other half of our production equation. Now, again, I talked about Michter's being a kind of a phoenix from the ashes story, a story of rebirth. And I think this is a really good example of it. So this beautiful building is our second distillery. This is the main street of Louisville. If you could stand with your back to that distillery and look across the road, you would see the Louisville Slugger Museum, which is where they produce baseball bats. So there is a line of Michter's branded baseball bats that are actually, if you go into Milroy's in Soho, you could see one behind the bar. So if anyone's in Milroy's, you can have a look. This beautiful building used to be a fort. There used to be a British Army barracks, which is why it's called Fort Nelson. Then it was the Louisville Post Office for a long time. And then it was abandoned and it was kind of falling apart. And the Malioka family purchased it and set about renovating it. And then it took them about, I don't think they expected how long it was going to take. It took them about 7 years of renovation and putting steel into the walls and making sure it didn't fall down to bring this place back to life. But this is our visitor center, but it's also a fully functioning distillery. So if you look at the right-hand side, you're going to see a couple of copper pot stills and you're going to see a couple of cypress wood fermenters, right? We talked about the original Pennsylvania Michter's back in the day that went bankrupt in 1989. Well, when it went bankrupt, all of the equipment was sold off and or stolen and or disappeared, vanished into thin air, more or less. Well, somehow, when we re-established Michter's, someone reached out to us and said, hey, you know, I think I might have the original Michter's pot stills in my garage somewhere. And it turns out he did. So we acquired them from that gentleman. We got the 2 cypress wood fermenters as well. And they were repaired and reinstalled by the sons of the guys who had installed them back in Pennsylvania in the day and brought back to life. And they're producing whiskey for us again today. A very small scale. They're producing about a barrel a day. So compared to Shively, it's a drop in the ocean. The whiskey from Fort Nelson hasn't been released yet. But if you ever find yourself in Louisville and Kentucky, you can absolutely go into Fort Nelson, have a tour around, see how everything's done. And you can pour whiskey directly from the barrels and fill your own bottle yourself. So I think it's just a kind of nice circularity to bringing history back to life and putting it to work again, you know?
No, that is fascinating. And of that production, how much of that, does any of that make its way into the core releases?
It doesn't yet, no, because it's going to be a separate special release. It's just not ready yet because Fort Nelson's a more recent project. So if you think about it, it hasn't quite had time to mature enough yet, and there isn't quite enough of it yet. But someday we're going to do that as a
separate, right? Yeah, because I mean, I suppose that it's a bit like what it reminds me of. Not to mention another brand, but Kilbeggan in Ireland have a tiny little old. It's the old Tullamore Dew still. Yes. It's meant to be the oldest operational still in the world in the Kilbeggan distillery, and then they have their Cooley distillery, and they claim, I can only take the word of it, that a very small amount of that goes into their core blends as kind of a little DNA nod. I don't know if it's a marketing ploy, if it's true, but it's interesting. Kind of nod to history, but I think it'd be more interesting to do what you're saying there in terms of a standalone release you can taste in its own merits.
Absolutely, yeah. Because the key difference is those little pot stills are going to have a very different texture and mouthfeel and perhaps flavor profile than the massive column the pot still has. So it's, as I said, it'd be very interesting to see that as a standalone product. I think, you know, it'll be much better that way for us.
Yeah, you will send me a sample, Stephen, when it's out. So we will come on to the next one. Is this sour
mash?
Sour mash, yeah.
Let's talk about the sour mash whiskey now. So this is one of my favorite ones to talk about because it's automatically a conversation starter. Because people say, well, what's sour mash, right? And it requires a decent bit of explanation. First of all, no, it doesn't mean the whiskey is sour. That's one key thing to talk about. Sour mash is a process and it is a marketing term, right? So first of all, we're going to talk about the process because that's probably the most important bit. Sour mash is when you are fermenting, right? So you're fermenting your grains. When you're finished distilling, you've got some liquid left in the bottom of the still. and that is an acidic kind of remnant that's left over, which is why it's called sour. You take that and you put it into the fermentation of the next batch, right? You're taking that acidic mixture that's left from one distillation and you're putting it into the start of the fermentation of the next batch. Why do you do that? Well, it gives you consistency of flavor between batches because there's always something of the old batch in the new batch. So it gives you that kind of common thread running through the batches for consistency of flavor. That's one thing. The other thing is because it's acidic, what it does is, I think we all probably know how fermentation works, but forgive me for saying it again. As that yeast is consuming the sugars and releasing ethanol, right? It produces ethanol, and then it produces it faster and faster and faster in sort of a bell curve like that. And then at a certain point, it produces so much ethanol, the yeast essentially poisons itself and stops production, right? Well, what increasing the acidity of the fermentation mash does is it smooths out that ethanol production curve. So instead of a short, sharp, whoop, loads of ethanol, bang, stop, it's more of a long, slower, smoother curve. And what that does is give us more of the alcohols that we're looking for and less of the both heavier and lighter alcohols that we're not necessarily looking for. So it's a way to smooth out that alcohol production curve, right? That's what sour mash is as a process. Now, this is the bit that gets confusing, right? Because every single whiskey we're going to taste tonight uses the sour mash production process. And I would estimate that probably 90% of the American whiskeys you will ever drink use the sour mash production process too. Then the question is, all right, well, why does this one have sour mash on the label? And this goes back to our good old 1950s advertising agency crew, because we talked about rye whiskey, right? And how it was kind of an unpopular category. It was seen as hillbilly, moonshine, wasn't seen as quality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That poses a problem for marketers and sales guys in general because of the laws. Because if you have more than 51% rye in your mash bill, by law, you have to put the words rye whiskey on your label. And back then, in the 50s and 60s, you might as well just sign your own death warrant because you weren't going to sell a drop if it had rye on the label. They thought, well, how can we get around that? Well, some clever guy thought, well, I mean, what if we just drop that rye content just a little bit below 51? We don't have to call it rye anymore, do we? No. All right. What'll we call it? We'll call it sour mash, because that became seen as a mark of quality, just like bourbon, right? Sour mash became seen as, oh, that's something that only quality whiskey brands do. So they called it a sour mash whiskey. So a sour mash nowadays is essentially, it's an American whiskey where it hasn't got enough corn to be a bourbon, but it hasn't got enough rye to be a rye. So it falls in between those two categories, and it's called a sour mash whiskey.
Yeah,
Makes
it's an
sense?
interesting point for them to arrive at. Sorry. This is a really interesting one. Tony says, finding the sour mash very agreeable but lighter on all fronts, vanilla and spice, or all fronts more vanilla and spice than previous, would definitely offer as beginners whiskey easygoing. I totally agree. I think if I was introducing someone to American whiskey and Michter was going to be the brand, out of the three we've tasted so far, this is probably the first one I would give them. Just a personal thing. Lewis says, agree, Tony. Light one, step away from a drink with something you chuck in with a mixer. Well, that's an interesting point. And Dylan says, I guess the sour mash dram will make a mean whiskey sour. Is that where you'd recommend its destination cocktail wise, or?
It does work very well, not because it's sour, but it does actually incidentally work very well in a whiskey sour, which is the funny thing. But it works well in cocktails in general. And I agree with what you said, Luke. It is a very good whiskey to bring people into the American whiskey category because it's got a slightly higher barley content than the rest of our whiskeys. It's got kind of a common thread for people that are already used to drinking Scotch. It's got something about it that is a little bit more familiar than the flavor profile of a bourbon or especially a rye might be. And because it's not as sweet as a bourbon, not as spicy as a rye, it hits that kind of golden mean middle ground where it's appealing to quite a lot of people, a broad segment of people. And the ABV again hitting that middle as well at 43%. It's quite a catch-all kind of flavor of our whiskey. So I think it's a very good entry point into American whiskey.
No, excellent. We'd love to keep hearing your comments, folks. This one is again £56. So same price as the rye. on our website. Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting. I personally actually prefer the first two, but yeah, as I say, as a someone who's not tried it before, someone who's not used to the kind of the sweetness, spices, you say, definitely. James says of the three so far, it's the one that tastes closest to Scotch slash Irish whiskey. And I think that's a good point. Actually, I don't know, Stephen, because James's point there has just triggered something in my head where he's obviously bracketed the E on Irish whiskey. American whiskey obviously uses the E as well. Is there a story you're aware of behind that, or is that a question you get asked a lot?
As far as I know, it is entirely due to the Irish influence that the biggest, I mean, before Prohibition, America was the absolute largest export market for Irish whiskey. So the vast majority of whiskey that was coming into the country was Irish. And as far as I know, they took their inspiration. That's yet another thing that Ireland can claim to its credit. That's what I've heard about it for sure. And if you look at the E convention with say Japan, they don't have the E because they took most of their whiskey culture and production methods and inspiration from Scotland, who doesn't use the E either. So America was more inspired by the Irish whiskey, and Japan was more inspired by Scotch whiskey, and that's the story I've heard. How true that is, well, I'm going to claim it anyway.
Yeah, no, it's a funny one because obviously the homogeny of the E in Irish whiskey only really emerges in the '60s, so it's quite late in the game. But I suppose Dublin whiskey would have been using an E prior to that, exporting a lot. So yeah, I mean it makes sense, and why not? I mean, yeah. Lewis Gibson says, sorry, I meant it's a starter drink, not heavy, smooth, unlike say a cask strength, something to tempt someone with who just sees whiskey, bourbon as something you have like a cliche JD and Coke. It was a compliment in a badly phrased way. I think we knew what you meant, Lewis, but thank you for clarifying.
It's not every day you want to have something like I love cask strength. I love really deep, complex whiskeys, but sometimes you just want to have a whiskey. Like you don't want to, not everything has to be blow your face off, like really, really intense. That's what I love as well. But sometimes people just want something easy to drink, smooth, tastes nice, goes down, not super deep, super complex. That's what they like. There's nothing wrong with having a range of different whiskeys for those occasions.
No, I totally agree. Matt Bright says still got the spice, certainly more buttery. No, I agree. The spice isn't totally absent there. So yeah, I mean, we'd love to hear any more comments on that one. But I suppose it might be time to slowly start coming on to the unblended. Stephen, if that's all right with you.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm just going to skip down a couple of things now. I'll come back to these in a minute, so don't worry about it. American unblended. This is another category that requires a little bit of explanation because we're very, very emphatic about the unblended part of it. Now, it's not because we think the blends aren't quality, because most of the whiskey in the world is blends and they're just mixes of single malt in the case of Scotch whiskey. Fantastic. Nothing wrong with that at all. The reason we emphasize this is because there is a category of American whiskey called blended American whiskey, which I hope you never have to drink and you'll never see on sale in Europe or the UK because you're not legally allowed to sell it over here. It's the stuff that if you walk into a 7-Eleven, you find on the bottom shelf. And blended American whiskey can legally contain 20% actual whiskey. The rest can be neutral grain alcohol, which is basically vodka. It can be color, flavor, sugar, flavor compounds, aftershave, God knows what, right? It's whiskey in the loosest possible term of the word, right? So that's why we're called unblended. So what Michter's unblended American whiskey basically is, right? It follows all of the rules for bourbon in terms of production, in terms of additives, like there's nothing added to it, no color, flavor, sugar, etc., etc. Follows all the rules of bourbon except for one, and that is that it's not purely aged in virgin oak barrels. It's aged in a mixture of virgin barrels, but also our own ex-bourbon barrels. Because we have all these beautiful bourbon barrels, ex-bourbon barrels that we sell on to the rest of the world. We sell on to the Scottish whiskey industry, to the Irish whiskey industry, to Japan. We even sell some to the wine business. And we thought, well, all these people are using our barrels to produce amazing products, which we love. It's fantastic to see that circle of life for a barrel. But what if we did something with them? But by doing that, that meant that it's not technically a bourbon anymore, which means it falls into the much broader and much looser category of American whiskey. So we really loved the final product. So we went to the Kentucky Distillers Association and said, look, we're producing an American whiskey, but it's the same quality as everything else you produce. There's nothing added to it. It's not adulterated in any way, shape, or form. Can you please let us call it something else? They come up with a different category just for us. They let us call it unblended American whiskey. And as far as we know, we're the only people that produce whiskey in this category. Maybe there's 3 guys in a shed somewhere that produce it we don't know about, but any distillery of scale that we're aware of, we're the only ones that produce it. So it is essentially would be a bourbon, except for the fact that it's finished in a mixture of new and our own ex bourbon barrels, which gives a slightly sweeter finish. It's essentially bourbon finished in bourbon barrels. That's an easy way to think about it, but not technically bourbon. But have a pour, have a smell, have a taste, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think about this one.
No, excellent. And meanwhile, we got some interesting points in. James says, I'm going back to previous tasting now. I can't remember exactly which one, but we talked about the wood. I remember an interesting fact about JD not being a drink producer, but a bourbon cask maker. The liquid is a byproduct. Do Michters sell a lot of their barrels, and they see it as an important part of their business? I do remember that tasting, James. I think I can't remember which tasting it was, like the same as yourself, but I do remember that comment. Yeah, I suppose. They produced Stephen. The fact on the tasting was that there's so many casks come from Jack Daniel's into Scotch whiskey that they could make a profit just off that alone. That anything that they sell whiskey wise is bonus income rather than a side product, as James says. How do you operate in terms of your economy in selling in bourbon casks? I know technically Jack Daniel's is not a bourbon cask, so when Scottish whiskey producers use it, they have to call it American oak and all that. So yeah, we won't get into those technicalities. I'm just clarifying, caveating it there. But yeah, how do you find selling on your bourbon casks into Scotland and Ireland?
That's a really interesting question. I'd never thought about it in that sense before, as it being a producer of casks and the whiskey being a side effect. I can say in our case, that's definitely not true. Purely not because of any ideological reason, which would explain it. But if you think about it purely in economical terms, right, our barrels are already way more expensive than the competition. Shall we say? Our barrels are about $50 each more expensive for us to buy than anybody else are. The barrels are actually the most expensive part of the process of making whiskey. It's not the bottles, it's not the grains, it's not the production, it's not the people. The barrel, if you think about it on a unit cost level, like for every bottle, the barrel is the most expensive bit of the process, and ours are very, very expensive. We do sell the vast majority of our barrels on because we think, well, it is good and for it to be reused. I mean, it means you don't have to chop down more forests to produce these barrels. We do sell them on. We sell them on, but we remove all of the branding from them first, so that they're not. We don't want people, releasing, say, a Japanese whiskey finished in Michter's barrels because it gets weird from a brand point of view. So we do sell them on. We remove all the branding first, so that they're anonymous and they go through brokers. We sell them all on, but there's no way in hell that we're selling them on for more than what we bought them for. I can tell you that for sure. So there's no way that we would make a profit purely from selling the barrels, because as fantastic as they are, they cost a lot of money, and then they spend a lot of time sitting still in a warehouse for a long time, which also costs money. So it wouldn't make sense from that point of view. But it is an interesting thing to think about, that so much of the broader whiskey and spirits and even wine ecosystem is based on the fact that bourbon is such a popular category. It would kind of be a house of cards if for some reason bourbon stopped being so popular, and then nobody could get bourbon barrels anymore, wouldn't it?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one, because obviously I could be wrong here, and this is, I suppose, a question from me, and it ties into Lewis's question here. So we'll double up my question onto Lewis's one, which he says I could be wrong as well. But I think bourbon will say it can only be a first fill cask. So I suppose my question is, my understanding, and it was a point I kind of touched on earlier, that it's only really, and even though there was a lot of virgin oak or first fill oak used before the rules around using bourbon and that it's like late 1960s or something that gets made into kind of part of the law. But that's in my head. I'm not saying that as fact. It's part of my question. So yeah, if you could clarify that as to why that's the case, and in terms of your selling on your whiskies unbranded and stuff, if the casks are so expensive, how come you don't just try and market them as Michter's barrels and make more money off it?
Okay, so I think the first question was, when did virgin barrels become law?
Yeah, I know. I suppose you touched it on the start, but not Mike. I was saying, was it the 1960s? But I suppose Lewis is just asking around the question of first fill casks and the fact that they all have they do all have to be bourbon and what's the first fill. to be bourbon. What's the kind of history behind that?
Okay, so a little bit more about barrels in general, because I think it all ties in together quite nicely. I mean, you can ask yourself, well, why is whiskey aged in barrels at all? And the reason was, well, barrels were used to transport things. So people would make new make whiskey, white dog whiskey, what they call new make, and they would stick in a barrel and they would drive it from, let's say for the sake of argument, from New Orleans down to Texas. Now, if you're going on a cart, it's going to take you quite a few weeks and or months to get there. And they noticed that when they got to the end, it tasted better. So they started to figure out, well, okay, we can mature things in barrels. Some of the laws for barrels with American whiskey, it has to be a charred new oak container. That's what the law says. First, we can talk about the charring bit, right? So why do people char barrels? And there's all sorts of technical explanations for why charring is fantastic for maturation, because the charcoal layer acts as a filter. It acts as a kind of mediator of the chemical process of maturation, because maturation in a barrel is a chemical process. It's the wood interacting with the compounds in the new make whiskey, and those things interacting with the broader environment and interacting with the things that are in the air and the sunlight, the temperature, all those forming a very complex chemical process, and the carbon layer helps to regulate that. But that's not why people started charring barrels. The reason people started charring barrels was because they said, okay, everything was transported in barrels. They weren't using new barrels at the time. They were using barrels that could have had something else in it before. So you think about it, your barrel had apples in it before. You probably stick your whiskey in that, I'd imagine it would actually taste quite nice when it came out. But what if your barrel had fish in it before? Not going to be great. How do you clean out a barrel? You char it. So what they used to do was they would stuff it full of straw, light it on fire, burn it out, purify it, make sure there was nothing left of what used to be in that barrel. And that's how you had the start of charring. That became a tradition. And then it became, even when it swapped over to using new barrels, it became part of the law, purely as a kind of a traditional holdover, but also to guarantee the quality and consistency of the way things were produced. Same thing goes for using new barrels. So originally it was to be a mark of quality that, hey, look, we're using new barrels and, it's 100% pure. But also the best thing about new barrels is it gives you this rich, intense flavor, right? So much of the distinctive character of bourbon comes from that heavy oak flavor. Much of the color also comes from that heavy oakiness. It's like if you use a barrel, say like Scotland and Ireland do, you use a barrel over and over and over again. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's like using a tea bag over and over and over again. The more you use it, the less and less impact on flavor it tends to have. So using new barrels is a way to impart much more flavor. The reason it became law, though, there is some argument over this. I would like to think that it was purely because it makes better whiskey, which I think it does in our case, like for the type of whiskey that we're producing. But there is an argument that it was a lot to do with the forestry lobby at the time that were like, well, if they can use the barrels over and over again, we don't need to sell them so much wood. But if they got to use new barrels every time, that ensures us a consistent supply of customers buying new barrels. So it probably is a mixture of the two, partly to do with quality and partly to do with a very powerful forestry lobby.
And there's it's nothing to do with the Coopers Union, which is something I've heard, which is the romantic story I like to tell in my head.
That's all. I mean, that's also ties into that supply chain. Coopers are an entire business to themselves, and they tie into that whole route to market of, all the way from the forest all the way down to the barrel. So it definitely ties into that too.
There's a couple of comments I'm going to come back to, so I'm not skipping over them. But James kind of chimed in but he said he's going to turn it around and said if the rest of the world stopped buying these barrels, how much would it affect companies like Michter's? Would it cost more to purchase a barrel that cost me turned on to consumer? And this was actually going to be part of my original comment, but I butchered it so much. Original question that I just decided to find the way out and ask something else. But I suppose it was the idea that we and this does tie into James's question as well, and that we being Scotch and Irish whiskey producers didn't use bourbon. It's a post Second World War phenomenon, so it's a very new thing, and it was driven by the economics because bourbon producers couldn't reuse them. They were therefore cheaper on the market to buy, and also the decline in sherry production and things like that. So how much would do you think in terms of James's question, would the kind of, if changing of regulations or sourcing barrels from elsewhere, which I can't see where they would come from, but hypothetically, would it have a huge impact on the industry and the cost? I mean, it's a massively growing industry. It's projected to the projection figures I was reading in the spirits business recently for the next few years of bourbon is absolutely insane.
Yeah, it's a complex question. Look, I'm not an economist, so I can only make an educated guess at this, right? I think if overnight, for some reason, the rest of the world decided they couldn't buy bourbon barrels anymore, that would have an immediate impact, because purely from an accounting point of view, say you buy, just for the sake of argument, right? It's not an exact figure. Say you buy a barrel for $200 and you've accounted for that in your cost of sales and everything else, but you've also accounted for the fact that after between 5 and 7 years, just say you got to sell it on for $50, just as an example. Then your real cost of that barrel, if we don't talk about interest rates and inflation and go down the finance rabbit hole, is about $150, and that's what your unit cost was based on, and that's what your margins were based on. So if it happened overnight, it would cause some havoc for sure, and I'd imagine prices would either have to be jacked up or people's margins would have to suffer, one or the other, depending on what sort of company it would be. Would definitely cause some chaos. In the longer term, things tend to return to equilibrium. So I would imagine that, look, there's an awful lot of oak forest in the United States. It is a massive continent that I think sometimes it's hard for us to wrap our head around just how big it is. They would produce more barrels. The unit cost would start to come down somewhat and things would come back to some sort of equilibrium. But I would imagine that it would be more costly to produce bourbon in general if they couldn't sell the barrels on at all after that. But maybe they'd find a different use for them and sell them on in a different way or recycle them in some other way, you know. But it would definitely have an impact if it was sudden.
No, excellent. We'll come on to some of the other questions. Chris has said, sorry about all my messages have been direct messages, some poor soul. I said about 10 minutes ago that I thought the Irish whiskey was better in the 1800s, so they added the E to differentiate. I mean, I know that that's partially true, Chris. The Dublin distilleries thought that their style was unique. They claimed to be minimum 7 years in the wood and particular mash bills and stuff. So they differentiated themselves with the knee, but producers in massive producers in Derry, Belfast, Cork, Limerick didn't adopt the E at that time. So it wasn't an all Irish thing at a time when Ireland was producing a huge amount of whiskey. I hope you don't mind me answering that question, Stephen. We said, Sean had asked, notice that these are all marked US #1. Is there a significance to US, US asterisk, it's an asterisk, isn't it? #1. Is there a significance to the US asterisk #1 designation?
There absolutely is. So it's actually two separate things. So we talked about Schenk's Distillery earlier on, which was over in Pennsylvania back in 1753. And that was actually the United States' first distilling company after they got independence from their lovely British overlords. That was US #1 distillery, like the first, right? So it refers to that. But the other thing it refers to is the grade of grains that we use, right? There's different levels of grain in the United States. So US 3 is, I believe, used for a cattle feed, and it's like, you know, it's fine, but it's not human consumption. US 2 is standard grade grain that's used for making bread and making food and everything you can think of for normal levels. And US 1 is the highest possible level of quality for grain, and that's the only type of grain that we use. That's hence the US 1 range. It refers to those two things.
No, that's excellent. Thanks for clarifying that. We had a few more questions in there, but I'm a bit conscious of whether or not we should come on to the next whiskey. But I suppose we give it another minute or so. In terms of tasting notes, we've also got another one who said that this isn't Pete's not a big fan of this. Chris says, wow, the finish this was very nice, spicy at the start, it's sweet like at the end. Matt said, this tastes like the first and only Michters I've had prior to today. Hits all the tastes I like: toffee, butterscotch, vanilla. My favorite so far. Very easy drinking. James says, we're literally, I'm just reading out of context there, but Mel says butterscotch, butter, peach, oak for me. Craig says fabulous, caramel sugars, nutmeg, light and sweet with a light spicy finish. Is there an age on this one? Do you know roughly age wise, Stephen? And there was also a question about mash bills as well there in terms of grain proportion. Is it similar to the bourbon? Maybe you could tie those two questions in together.
Absolutely, yeah. So the first of all, with age, all the US 1 range are usually between 5 and 7. Minimum, absolute minimum 4, but normally between 5 and 7. I can't tell you how much this batch exactly is because there's too many batches to think about that. But between 5 and 7 is what you can assume. With mash bill, this is more corn heavy than the bourbon is. I can tell you that for sure, as you notice with the sweeter flavor profile. What I really love about the American whiskey is, right, it is not the most complex whiskey you'll ever try in your life. I think it's a very good entry point to people who are new to whiskey in general, not just American whiskey, because lower ABV, a little bit lighter, a little bit sweeter. But that's not to say that it's just a beginner's whiskey that you then discard as you get more experience, because I still love to drink this. I've drank more whiskey than I can shake a stick at, and I still love this, especially as either a dessert whiskey, goes very well after dinner. But the other thing is in the summer, sometimes you want something a little bit lighter, a little bit more refreshing. If you make a whiskey soda, like a whiskey highball with soda water with this, fantastic. You get that lovely butterscotch note comes through. It's got a little bit of sweetness, but there's no sugar in there because it's a distilled product, so you don't get stickiness. It's beautiful at that. I really love that butterscotch note that comes through.
No, fantastic. Craig says it's ideal with a summer barbecue. Tony says it's more sophisticated, subtle with some flavors I like. So will we maybe move on to the last one and any other slides you've got here? And
I'm just going to show you one. We didn't have time to go over all the technical production spec stuff, but there's one I wanted to show you, which is the barrel entry proof, that I think is probably the most interesting for the crowd that we have tonight. So let me show you that, then we'll do the last whiskey, and then I'll...
Marvelous. And I sorry, Craig, is just, I realized I've forgotten to give the price on this one. So sorry for interrupting you there, Stephen. So the unblended is £58 on the website, and like I say, after this whiskey, I'll give the discount code, which will give you 15% off of that price as well. So, sorry, Stephen.
That's all right. It's all right. I'm really enjoying all the questions we get tonight. It's way more interactive than any of the other virtual tastings I've done. So thank you so much for the questions. It's way more fun like this. There's one thing I talked about earlier was the barrel entry proof. So some people mentioned the mouthfeel, the viscosity, how thick and oily the whiskey was, and that's mostly related to this. So there's one takeaway of the technical stuff we talked about tonight that you can remember. I think this is probably the most important. So that new make spirit comes off the still at 69% ABV, right? The legal maximum that you can put into the barrel at is 62.5%. And that's what almost everybody does, because the more concentrate the whiskey is in the barrel, the fewer barrels you use. And as we mentioned earlier, the barrel is the most expensive bit. So the fewer barrels you use, more margins, more money, everyone's happy. Except us, because we're weird, awkward people who like to do things the old-fashioned way. The standard was not always 62.5. That's post-prohibition, and that was raised from 51.5 to 62.5 to give distillers a bit more margin, let them recover, let them make a little bit more money. We like it the old way, so we still barrel our whiskey at 51.5% ABV, right? So that means that we're adding distilled water to the barrel. We're adding more water than our competitors are. All right, so what? Who cares? What does that mean? A few different things. If you've ever tried to make an old-fashioned at home with actual cane sugar, and you're stirring the whiskey in the sugar, and you're stirring and you're stirring, and it's not dissolving, right? Well, the reason for that is the sugars don't dissolve very well in alcohol. They dissolve much better in water. Water is a much better solvent. So the more water you have in that barrel, the more easily those natural wood sugars and fatty acid compounds of the wood can dissolve into the whiskey. So more water content helps us to pull much more flavor out of the barrel, just because water is a better solvent, right? That's one thing. So more flavor. The second thing, we've all drank cheap whiskey, right? And you get that feeling like you've swallowed a broken light bulb, like razor blades going down your throat, right? And everyone thinks that's the alcohol, but it can't be the alcohol, because you can drink that stuff at 69% straight off the still. It doesn't burn. I mean, you'll feel it, but it doesn't burn, right? The burn actually comes from these compounds in the wood, and these are called polyphenolic compounds. I can't believe I said that right. I always stumble over that word. Polyphenols, right? These bitter, dry, astringent wood compounds. That's what makes it, give it that burn. But they also break up more easily the higher the water content. So that's why even with some of the Michter's whiskeys that are very high, like up 55, 56, they still don't burn. They're warming, don't burn. But the third and probably the most important part of it is this. So hopefully this slide works, right? So you can see there they went in. So the one on the left is a Michter's one, more water in the barrel. The one on the right is a standard bourbon, less water in the barrel. After between 5 and 7 years of maturation, right? Because Kentucky is hot and dry, the ABV actually goes up over time in the barrel. So while the overall level of the liquid goes down because of evaporation, because the air is so dry, the water is not being replaced. So the overall balance of ethanol and water changes. So if we go in at 51.5, we end up at around about 55, 56 after between 5 and 7 years, okay? Somewhere that's cold and wet and miserable like Ireland or Scotland, it happens the other way around. There's so much water in the air that whatever evaporates gets replaced and the ABV goes down over time, right? So we're sitting at 55, 56. Our competitors who went in at 62.5 now sitting at 67, 68, 69. Okay, so, well, when you go to bottle it, so we take the bourbon as an example, that's 45.7. If you want to bring that from 56 down to 45, that's about this much water. If you want to bring that from 68 down to 55, that's about that much water. It means that there's literally more whiskey in the bottle with our whiskeys than there are with people who don't use that barrel entry proof. Less of this is distilled water, more of this is what's been sitting in that barrel for between 5 and 7 years. That's where you get richer flavor. That's where you get more viscosity and oiliness. That's why it's a darker color, because it's more concentrated. And if you go to make a drink with it, everything you do to make a drink adds, if you add ice to your whiskey or you stir it into an old fashioned, that's adding dilution. Because it starts off with less dilution, you're going to taste it much more, even if you add a little bit of dilution in the cocktail. Make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah.
Fantastic. Any questions on that?
Well, while anyone's typing in potential questions, I've got a kind of a semi-adjacent question in the sense that it's also about Michter's. Is there a Michter's whiskey that we've not tried tonight that's in this price point of the kind of 50 to 60 that we're trying in terms of your wider core range? And also, does Michter's do a cask strength whiskey?
Answer to question one, is there anything in the same price point? Not really, because even the toasted sour mash we're going to try last is, I believe, you have to double check, I believe it's like 110, 120-ish as standard, but the regular US1 range is the only ones that are around about the £60 mark. As for barrel strength, we do a couple of ones that are barrel strength. We do a barrel strength rye, which I'm not entirely sure has been released. I mean, it comes out every year. I'm thinking this year either it was recently released or it's coming soon. I have to double check with my colleague Sarah in a minute. And we also do a toasted barrel strength rye, which is the same thing, but the toasted version. And those are between 55 and 57, depending on the casks. Those are our barrel strength releases.
Marvelous. And so James has obviously come on to the toasted one. Sorry, he hasn't. I misread his message, but we may as well, before we come to James's point, to come on to the toasted, and then we could take some more questions after that, Stephen, if that's all right. And the toasted on our website, which touching on James' actual question, is out of stock at the moment, because he said he loves the toasted, which is possible to get for anyone who's not looking at the chat. So yeah, we don't have it available for you tonight, folks, I'm afraid. But it's one to watch out for on the website for down the line. But all the other four in the tasting are available and have the 15% discount. So worth checking them out. So this is kind of a treat, because we're trying something that obviously isn't available at the moment, and as James said, is quite hard to get. Over to you, Stephen. So.
The toasted releases, we do a different one every year. So the ones we've done so far are toasted bourbon. We did toasted sour mash. We did toasted barrel strength rye. Those are all we've done so far, and we rotate them year on year. What is toasting, right? So I'm going to flick back real quickly just to show you. We're talking about the barrels. So I said by law we have to char all the barrels, and charring is a short, sharp, intense burning process. You literally set the barrel on fire on the inside. Toasting is a low, slow cooking process where you're basically cooking that barrel from the inside out over a small oak fire, right? It doesn't actually catch fire, it doesn't burn. Toasting is optional. It's something that we borrowed from the wine trade. That's where it really originated. Whereas toasting is essentially you're cooking the barrel, right? You're caramelizing all those natural wood sugars in there. So you're sweetening the barrel, making it slightly nuttier in flavor. There's all different levels of toast you can do. I mean, depending on the temperature, the duration, how you do it. So a lot of variety and like knobs you can turn on your flavor profile of the wood. Charring also opens up the grain of the wood. So you can see here in this picture, you see charred and you see toasted and charred, right? So if you just char a barrel, you can see the whiskey. This is an experiment we did, right? So we took one barrel that was charred and one that was toasted and charred. We filled both of them up with whiskey for 5 years, emptied the whiskey out, took the barrels apart and had a look at the wood. On the left is the one that was only charred. And you can see that whiskey is only soaked in maybe what? Is that not even a quarter, maybe a fifth of the way into the wood, right? But the one that was toasted and charred, you can see that thick black line where the whiskey soaked in 3/4 of the way. That means that it's soaking much deeper into the wood because we're opening up the channels in the wood through the heating process, and you're sucking out much more flavor. So if you've gone through all the process of harvesting the best wood, air drying it for between 18 months and 5 years, this is the way to get the most flavor out of the wood, right? So that's what toasting is. I'm going to switch back to the toasted sour mash and talk about that quickly. This is exactly the same liquid as the regular sour mash we tasted earlier. So somewhere between a bourbon and a rye, not quite either, kind of balance the flavor. And what we do is when it comes out of the first barrel that it's in, which is in between 5 and 7 years, we take that whiskey and we finish it in a barrel that's only been toasted but not charred, right? Because all of our regular barrels are toasted and charred. So the first barrel is toasted and charred. Then the second barrel that we finished this one in is only toasted. And it just changes up that flavor profile of the whiskey entirely and gives it a much nuttier, much more focus on the oaky wood notes.
Is that a particular style of white oak, the new American?
I think that's the style called the typo style. Isn't it?
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on blast on that. I just
yeah, that's somebody in marketing team is gonna get fired for that. But so that's what it is. It's basically a toasted barrel finish of our regular sour mash whiskey, and really illustrates it. It shows what that toasting process adds to our whiskeys in general, because it's dialing up how much the toast has contributed to the flavor of this particular whiskey. But as with everything else, have a smell, have a taste. Tell me what you think, because that's what's important.
Marvelous. So we got some. Because some people had already jumped ahead, and I don't blame them. The conversation previously was fascinating. We got through a lot of questions and stuff, but if I was thirsty, I probably would have jumped ahead as well. Dennis said, notice that you've done 10-year-old releases, toasted bourbon release / toasted sour mash is goalless to get a hold of. When can we potentially see more come back into stock, and will we ever see a W Club Michter's bottle / selected barrel? So that's going to tie in with a previous question that was asked as well about when will the toasted oak be back in stock. I suppose I don't know, but I presume we'll get some when the next batch comes out. Do you know when that will be?
So I've got good news and bad news in those questions. The 10-year bourbon and 10-year rye are on the way. Give it a few months and they'll be back in the UK, but they will. I mean, the whiskey shop will obviously get an allocation. They will sell out like immediately. So I don't know if you guys do a mailing list or some other way to notify people of the limited release that come in, but they are on the way. As for toasted, they haven't announced the toasted release for this year. Usually there's either a barrel strength or a toasted coming this year. I'm not entirely sure which one it is yet, but 10-year bourbon, 10-year rye definitely on the way. But you have to keep your eyes open because they tend to vanish very, very quickly. Second question was about a W Club barrel pick. You don't do barrel picks for anybody ever. People have been asking us for 20 years, and they've.
But if you did, you'd do it for us, though, wouldn't you? Hypothetically.
I'm not going to say that on camera, but look, it's a philosophy they chose. It just wasn't a business that they wanted to get involved in for whatever reason. The only time they ever did a barrel pick during COVID relief, where they sold one barrel of 10-year-old bourbon, and that went for I think £250,000. Like, that was one of the only times they've ever done it, and probably the first and only time they will ever do it. So unfortunately, I don't think there will be a W Club barrel pick, but in terms of the limited items, I'm sure the whiskey shop will definitely get a nice allocation.
Brilliant. Tony C says, have savoured all of these, but think toasted wins for me. I've really enjoyed IGP or EGS's /distillation chat too. All new to me. Many thanks, Stephen. Craig says, wow, sweet and soft, woody and earthy with a hint of walnut and hazelnut. Excellent tasting notes, Craig. And Sean has asked a technical question going back to our chat about barrels. Would you expect a lower ABV on the toasted barrels if the volatiles are penetrating deeper into the barrel and more likely to be lost to the environment? Is that affected ABV or that you're aware of, Stephen?
That's a very, very good question. Nobody's ever asked me that before. The short answer is no, because it's the same ABV as the standard one. And the reason for that, I'm sure if we left it there a lot longer, it probably would have an impact, but it is a much, much shorter maturation period. So think weeks to months rather than years. So it doesn't really have enough time to lose any ABV in that sense, you know?
Yeah. Great. Ian says, tasting be great tonight. Thanks, Stephen, for all the info. Very interesting. I would like to kind of to reiterate that. It's been brilliant, Stephen. Before we finish up, we normally get everyone to, and I will get the discount code while you're doing this, but we get everyone to ask to tell us what their favorite one was or what order they preferred them in. So please do get typing in with that. And in the meantime, I will just pull up the correct discount code. Is there anything you would like to add before we finish up, Stephen?
Look, I just love to thank you all again. I mean, I really, really enjoyed this session. I loved how interactive it was. I loved the questions because some of them really kept me on my toes. I mean, some tastings I can just breeze through and do it with my eyes closed. This one really kept me alert, and you really asked some fantastic questions that made me think about things. There's a few things I need to go back and ask our production team as well to make sure I fully understand. So thank you for that. I really appreciate you all joining me. Thank you to Luke from the Whisky Shop for setting this up and organizing it. I mean, this is an absolute genuine pleasure. And thank you also to my wonderful colleague, Sarah Parr, for originating this in Specialty Brands. So look, I really, really enjoyed this. I'll be happy to do it again sometime for you guys if you'd like, with a different set of whiskies. But thank you again so much. Really, really appreciate it.
Brilliant. No, thank you, Stephen, for giving up your time, and thank you, again, to Specialty Brands and Sarah for helping organise this. We'll just go through some of the end comments before we finish the call. So it looks like Toasted is winning, and then between the bourbon and the rye, it looks like a bit of a toss up. But I would say, actually no, I'd say the bourbon actually probably is ahead, because people look up at that first as well. So that's interesting and great to see what people are thinking. Dylan says, brilliant stuff. Thank you, Stephen. Luke, Toasted Barrel was the top one. Brilliant, Dylan. Thank you. Steph says, impossible to tell tonight, which is a great compliment to the brand. And I really loved the explanations and storytelling. Excellent night. Rye was a standout, says Kirsty. Thanks, Stephen. The most informative tasting session for a long time. Excellent. That's high praise. You wouldn't say that if you didn't mean it, Stephen. James, in terms of order, I enjoyed the toasted bourbon and unblended as a close second, followed by the sour mash and the rye in last. Must admit, enjoyed all five. Distinctive flavor. Bourbon to me was most different to the rest. First time on the American whiskey. Would be happy to fetch any of these bottles to the party. And Pete's iPhone says, different range, good introduction for new people or beginners. And there's a few more comments there along similar vein and places order. So thank you everyone for your good feedback. I had typed into the chat the discount code, but for anyone who missed it, I'll type it again and I'll say it out now. It's WS16MVT. So that's Whisky Shop 16 Michter's virtual tasting. If you're trying to remember it. So you add that, and then any of the products we tried tonight, which will be available via the link in your cocktail card, but also on the original product page for the tasting, we hyperlink them all in there. So or you can search on the website, either way, all those will work. Add them to your basket and you'll get 15% off of all these whiskies that we tried tonight. But unfortunately, as mentioned, the toasted barrels is not available. Stephen, thank you again so much for your time. It's been absolutely fantastic and really informative. And we maybe get you on again down the line.
It'll be an absolute pleasure. And look, thank you all again, and cheers to you all. Good night.
Sláinte. Good night. We'll see you folks. And yeah, for anyone who hasn't purchased already, there's Deanston next Thursday. So that's still on sale. There's still time to get that in, and we'll have another tasting going on sale either on Friday or Monday. So keep an eye on your emails, and we'll see you on the next one. And this is your first time, please do come back. So thanks again, Stephen, and we'll talk to you later, folks.